Breakbulk Europe's Connect 21. I'm your host, Leslie Meredith, and in today's session, we will be focusing on offshore wind, a tremendously promising project sector and one that showed its resilience and success throughout the pandemic and shows no signs of slowing down. So it's a great opportunity for people in our industry. And today I have two highly qualified guests who will be joining the discussion. I have Fleming Bream, Logistics Product Line Director from Ørsted, and Thomas Poulsen, who heads up Pantacon and is the facilitator of Wind Logistics Group. So welcome, both of you. It's great to have you join me today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Absolutely. Yeah, good to see you too. All right, so let's see. Thomas, in the past decade, your MBA and PhD focused on offshore wind from a transportation and logistics perspective. And as the facilitator of Wind Logistics Group, can you please give us a quick background on WLG, Pantacon, and of course yourself? I think it's a fascinating story, the way your academic studies led into your business operation. So give us a quick introduction.
Yeah, thank you, Leslie. And I think I used to be a consultant and I wanted to do a PhD and got some funding for it. And the people who provided the funding wanted the PhD to be more practically relevant. So that's really with Ørsted's help how we originally started Wind Logistics Group as an academic forum. Now it's become a business-to-business forum, and with a renewed purpose to sort of work cross supply chain. The members are from across the supply chain, so Ørsted as a developer, but also turbine manufacturers and different kinds of people from the different supply chain layers that all have logistical issues that they need to resolve. So the group has really been active for 7 years now, and today the purpose is that it solves industry-related challenges. So if something is bilateral between two companies, Wind Logistics Group is not the right forum. But if it's something across the industry, then it's the right place to address things. And I think on my own company, Pantacon, it's a smaller niche consulting company working on offshore wind and logistics, and we concentrate on strategy, M&A, and also market intelligence. So that's a bit about me.
All right, well, that is great. All right, Fleming, let's turn to you. It's great to have you representing Ørsted here today, certainly a global leader in this market. And as a company, an extremely interesting history coming from oil and gas and making the pivot to renewables. So give us a little background about yourself and Ørsted.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, as you know, Ørsted has transitioned itself from being an oil and gas company in Denmark, but now we are purely focusing on renewable energy. That's both onshore and offshore wind, but also solar power across the world. We are currently the world leader in offshore wind, and we have more than 10 gigawatt installed capacity, mostly in Northern Europe, where the market started. But we are expecting to more than double that within the next few years, and that will be with a global presence. So, and I am in Ørsted. I'm responsible for procurement for transport and installation scopes for all the future wind farms across the world. And I've been working in Ørsted for the last 6.5 years, doing these kind of things. And before that, I was working for one of the big manufacturers of offshore wind turbines here in Denmark. So I believe I have some insights both in the supply chain but also in the developer side of the industry. And
absolutely.
And we met Thomas some years back, as Ørsted has been one of the first supporters of the Wind Logistic Group, and we have been a part of the Wind Logistic Group since it was inaugurated back in 2013. So.
Well, you two have a long history, and just as I said, so much expertise. So we are going to take this discussion and break it into 3 parts. We'll look at offshore wind transportation in the future, the globalization of offshore wind and the impact on transportation and logistics, and we will look at innovation in transportation and logistics as the market matures even further. All right, so we're going to start with the future, sort of a upside down agenda today. All right, let's see, Fleming, what will transportation needs of developers look like 5 years from now? And is that different from market to market too?
Yeah, I think what we come from is sort of a very localized business, mostly centered about the Northern Europe, maybe even more specifically around the North Sea. But we now see it becoming a truly global industry. And we will see the future wind farms, they will be built by a mix of locally produced components, but also imported components from all around the world where the supply chain are. And that depends a lot on where we are. But I think we will see both suppliers specializing in heavy transport, such as transportation of very big monopiles, 100-meter long monopiles, or even the big jackets that we see for the offshore substations. That's a big specialized part of the transportation. But we will also see suppliers around the world focusing on transportation and installation of high voltage cables on the seabed. So I think a lot of already in place heavy transport vessels that can be used, but also a lot of new highly specialized vessels being put into play.
Interesting. Do you think we could see new partnerships and collaborations, perhaps as a closer tie between steel manufacturers and transport providers?
Yeah, I think there will at least be more direct cooperation between the transportation companies and the steel manufacturers, because they have a shared interest in enabling the big components being transported in the most efficient way from around the globe. So I will certainly expect to see that the big bulk transportation companies are looking into how to optimize deck storage of monopiles, for instance, as an example. So.
All right. Thomas, how do you see transportation and logistics contracts evolving?
Well, I think that if we look at sort of the contract scope, then when I think of an offshore wind farm, I think of 3 different contract scopes that are controlled ultimately by the developer, represented by Ørsted here today. But the first scope is really the wind turbines, so the towers, the nacelles, the blades, and that scope is usually so far controlled by the turbine manufacturers. And then we have the offshore transmission infrastructure, both on land and also offshore. And in many countries, that's a kind of national task that some kind of national government body has the responsibility for. In some countries, it is the role of the developer to build this. For example, in the UK, Ørsted would have to build it and then auction it off back to someone else. So different countries have different rules, but generally that's a different contract scope than the turbines. And then the last scope is what we call balance of plant. So anything inside this large offshore wind farm that doesn't have to do with the turbines themselves and the transmission infrastructure. So turbine foundations and cables between the turbines. So that's usually how the contracts are structured with different owners of each of these contract portions.
All right. often the transportation of the balance of plant components are included in a balance of plant contract or a transport and installation contract from the developers. Fleming, going forward, do you see the transport scope being split and sourced separately by the developer, such as yourself, in case of global transport components?
Well, I think it's of course a simple question, but it can't be answered that simple because it's not a one size fit all solution. As a projects differ a lot from country to country, and we will most likely see that the transportation and installation will be split off if there's a long distance from the supply chain, from the supplier to the site where the wind farm is going to be built. We see projects that are in need of a big supply buffer in order to make their schedule and the installation schedule. And in that case, we will most likely see transportation being as a separate contract. But having said that, splitting up the contracts will also introduce more complexity in how we run our development. And normally we as developers, we don't like too much complexity. So if we take an example like we have on our Greater Changhua 1 and 2 project in Taiwan, which is being constructed as we speak, we have teamed up with a big heavy lift vessel provider who can handle both the transportation for the jackets from Samkang in South Korea to the site in Taiwan, and they also do the installation of these jackets. So that's a big balance of plant project that we are running with this supplier, and we are super happy about that kind of contract where we see them really embracing the new market here.
Absolutely. Thomas, are the contracts themselves, do you see them evolving over time in different markets?
Yes, very much so, Leslie. I think that as the individual offshore wind markets first emerge, and then as they mature during the course of time, experience is of course built locally. And this experience is both when it comes to manufacturing, the landside logistics, the port management, the maritime transportation, and also installation, as Fleming just spoke to. So I very much see that over time, as a market gains this kind of track record and builds scale, and more projects come on stream, then the transportation and logistics chains, they evolve. And actually, I think there's a trend to see that fewer, more dominant providers come in and provide broader, deeper, larger contract scope solutions. And local companies in the markets, in the new markets like Taiwan or America or Japan, South Korea, some of these markets where offshore wind is going right now, outside North Europe, these local companies, they get more involved and they get more experienced. And there is a local workforce that also gains the necessary competencies over time. So in the beginning, we kind of import a lot of things, and then over time, a lot of it will root and become localized. So the market sort of it has different stages of development, and different partnerships and alliances are then forced, joint ventures, as Fleming was talking about, between companies where you often see knowledge and companies from existing offshore wind markets getting coupled up with companies in the new markets.
That makes a lot of sense. Fleming, let's turn to you as we start our next topic of this session, which is globalization. So you've talked about Ørsted's expanded significantly in Europe and now is working on big projects globally. I know in the US, for instance, and also the project you talked about in Taiwan. What is the secret formula for transportation and logistics from your view?
Yeah, I won't tell. So
You have to.
yeah.
It's a
Well,
Breakbulk exclusive.
yeah, it is. Yeah. Well, I think as a coming from Ørsted, where we built the first offshore wind farm in Denmark more than 25 years ago, it has actually just recently been decommissioned, the first one. So we have learned a lot, both what's good and what's bad in the market. And I think as we have developed slowly using old fishing boats and other non-purpose vessels, we have seen that the market evolvement has been progressing slowly, and we are now seeing a lot of specialized vessels. The market has matured from Denmark now, Germany, UK being the very big markets in offshore wind, but we also see expansion into further down into Europe. The Netherlands, Belgium, France, Spain are all going for offshore wind. And we also see now coming towards the east, as we see Poland has just said that they will build more than 10 gigawatt before 2030, which is super ambitious. We see the Baltic nations coming up and Finland as well. So it is becoming a very big market. Of course, it started in Europe and it's still mainly focused in Europe, but we can see the expansion towards Asia and the Americas as being very big. And I think we in Ørsted, we try to bring our industry knowledge to the new markets and together with our new partners in these markets, develop how do we do logistic and supply chain in these markets so that it's not just a cost exercise, but also sort of a way of ensuring that we have a sustainable supply chain in these new markets. And as you said, as the US is now very, very much in focus as they have already now said that they would have more than 30 gigawatt commissioning before 2030, which is super ambitious. So we certainly see a pipeline and we see a market that will enable the investments needed for new ports and new assets as vessel types and stuff like that. So I think that's sort of the way that that we develop the industry is by going to the new market and joining up with the local supply chain and together defining how we do it in that market.
That is interesting, the way you are collaborating and taking the experience that you've learned in established markets to these newer ones. And thinking about that, how important to a project, Thomas, are people and competencies, particularly in these new markets?
Well, I think the right people, the right competencies at each of the projects is absolutely critical to success. I think when you sort of move from one country to the neighboring country, you often have dimensions like language and geographical coverage easily resolved, because you can maybe cover the neighboring country from your home, and maybe you don't need to really expand that dramatically. Maybe the language and the culture are fairly similar. When a new market is developing and in the early stages of the industry sort of changing its place and going to a new geography, then the industry needs to evolve, and it needs to make sure that it creates the right competencies. And in that beginning stage, this can be done ad hoc by bringing people from the experienced markets into those new markets. But in the case of offshore wind, because of this globalization we're seeing right now, there's really sort of a global competition on for talent. So where do the competent, the experienced, the qualified personnel go? The demand is great, both in private companies, but also in different parts of government in those countries where offshore wind is rapidly moving towards. So I think that because people and competencies are so critical, I think there's a need when offshore wind moves into new markets to create a formalized education process in that market, and also supplement the on-the-job training that's being done in the early stages by this sort of formalized education training process.
What other industries are making adaptations or alterations to have a future with offshore wind? We can talk about port infrastructure and perhaps some other areas that fall into this issue.
Yeah, yeah. As I briefly mentioned before, if there already is a market, an offshore market, then just the sheer knowledge of working offshore is a highly valued competence in the offshore wind industry. It is, of course, more challenging to put up a wind turbine offshore than it is onshore. So experience in working offshore is very important. We also see that in the new markets we enter, that port infrastructure and related port stuff is needed a very significant upgrade to cater for the very heavy components that we use in the offshore wind industry. The loads for the single components are very high, and the key walls need to be able to take that load. Otherwise, we won't get anywhere. And we also need a big storage area close by to have all these components in place. As you know, the offshore blades for the turbine is more than 100 meters long, and you need 3 for each. And if there's 100 turbines, then it's 300 blades times 100 meters in length. So it is quite area consuming. But we see that the local markets, they are embracing this, and we have seen Taichung Harbor in Taiwan being expanded very much to cater for this new industry. And we also now have ventured up with New London in Connecticut to make that as a hub in the future for offshore wind in the North Americas. So.
Good. So it's really interesting, I think, to see the sort of domino effect, in different markets across different industries. And certainly transportation and logistics will be an industry, and already has, that stands to benefit from offshore wind projects, particularly in these new markets. Thomas, will you give us a big picture view of which project cargo sectors stand to benefit and why?
Yeah, I think the different contract scopes that we talked about before are sort of determining the types of sectors that benefit. So turbines are transported and manufactured in one way. Monopiles, transition pieces, jackets are transported in another way, and these large cables are transported and installed in yet another way. So I think that there are a number of sub-markets that benefit from an offshore wind farm project being created. And I also think that there's a big benefit to an area where offshore wind farms are being located when it comes to sort of long-term job impact. So one thing is the manufacturing and the ports and the installation and the logistics during the construction period, but also during the 30-year service period that follows. I mean, there will be a number of jobs created for technicians and for managing components and modules and parts to go out offshore to the offshore wind farm. So I think there's a need for very sort of big vessels, heavy-duty construction stuff, and then there's also a need for this sort of regular servicing and maintenance of the offshore wind farms afterwards. And both, all of this is a fantastic opportunity for an area, because these are not small projects.
Okay, well, we've got a lot of opportunity. And now we're going to turn to our third topic, innovation. certainly this industry could drive incredible innovation across the value chain with increasing size and weight of offshore wind turbines, along with ambitious energy goals that so many countries around the world have put in place and I think have been accelerated over the last year. How will these factors and perhaps others create a need for continuous innovation, specifically within the heavy transport industry? Maybe Fleming, we'll start with you.
Yeah, I could, being a part of a renewable company, going green is certainly an innovation that we need to see in the transport industry. We need to see, we need to have it reflected that we are a renewable industry in also our construction, and we are in discussions with our main suppliers about, for instance, switching to LPG propellant instead of heavy fuel. And we also encourage the use of shore power when in port to be able to shut off the main engines and use electricity to run the vessel when in port. And that's not just coming from us; it's also coming from the local municipalities who don't want to have this heavy smoke coming out of the pipes in port. And I think besides that, we are long-term chartering new SOVs and CTVs that are hybrid vessels, both battery and LPG and normal fuel, in order to make this change go on. And by placing these 25-year contracts, we enable the industry to make these investments.
Okay, Thomas, what about sort of the end of the life cycle, if you will? Let's talk a little bit about the reverse supply chain.
Yeah, I think an important part of going green is also that you can certainly cater to this reverse process. So I think there's sort of, when I think about it, there's two reverse processes. One is exactly end of life. When you decommission the offshore wind plant, you usually the contracts come with a clause that says you have to deliver the site back to whoever you leased it from in a similar condition as you took it over. So you kind of have to dismantle in a reverse process the entire offshore wind farm. But during the 25 or 30-year operation scope, there's also a reverse life cycle phase or a reverse chain that takes place. So I think the operators of the wind farms are really trying their best to reuse the parts, the modules, the components that they replace in these offshore wind farms. So they bring them back to shore, they try to refurbish them, they try to make sure that they are reused somehow, so that there's a kind of cradle to cradle process going on.
Fleming, when you look at the transportation and logistics supply chain going forward, what is needed?
Well, I think going into new markets, we often find that these countries have some kind of cabotage ruling based on some historical events that happened in that country. And I think we, as an industry, supply chain and developers, we need to come together and work together to find a way to deal with these cabotage rules. One of the ways could be that a European company joins up with, for instance, a Japanese company and reflag a European vessel to that market so that it fits the cabotage rules there. But for instance, in the US, where we have the Jones Act, we need to see new vessels come into play, because there are no suitable installation vessels available in the US. But we see a pipeline and we see projects that should be able to facilitate these new builds. So I hope we'll see that coming forward.
Thomas, at Panicon, you work a lot in the new offshore wind markets around the world. Do you find that the market forces are generally able to have the necessary transportation and logistics assets emerge in a timely manner ahead of actual offshore wind farm project needs?
Well, I think that the reason why offshore wind is moving very quickly to areas outside Northern Europe right now is that Ørsted and one other developer is coming out with a subsidy-free, so no taxpayer money offshore wind farm as early as a couple of years from now. And when governments look at that around the world, when nations look at that, they really would like to get that. So how can I get renewable energy that doesn't cost me anything? That's just in a market equilibrium. And so I think what the challenge is that in those new countries there is no supply chain, and they don't have the necessary transportation and logistics assets or ports as we've talked about today. So in Europe, all of that is in place, and the industry has been going for several decades. So that's how some of these markets have been able to get to nirvana, or what you want to call it, in terms of this zero subsidy stage that they've gotten to. So it takes time. It takes a long-term commitment. It takes a pipeline of offshore wind farm projects in a new country, be that Taiwan, Japan, US, in order for the industry to develop. And that goes also for logistics, supply chain, transportation offshore. So in the beginning, I think the countries are not ready, but over time they will be.
And has that been your experience, Fleming?
Yes, it certainly has. As Thomas mentioned, we have the first completely merchant wind farm going online in Germany in 23-24, and we will see that progressing, expanding all over these markets where the industry is mature. And it will also follow in Taiwan, in the US, in some years from now. But for now, they need to mature, and to mature, we need some funding, and we certainly need some commitment from the governmental side to make this happen.
Okay, great. I want to thank you both for giving us such a clear view of the supply chain around offshore wind, what's happening today, what your plans are, what we should be looking at for the future. So thank you so much for joining me, and I look forward to seeing you relatively soon, hopefully at Breakbulk Europe 2022 in Rotterdam.